this film started really after. I mean, Gabriel often tells a story of when he directly after Julian was thrown into Belmarsh, dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy and thrown into Belmarsh. John Shipton, that's Julian's father, the subject of the film, and Gabriel went to see Julian. It was John Pilger. It was the three of them on that particular visit. And Gabriel came away thinking that it was the last time that he might see Julian because he saw him in such a bad way. And, much the same way that we've all asked ourselves, even, also as members of the family, like, what can we do? Gabriel asked himself, what can he do?
They like to be associated with food because it's such a benign and sort of nice thing. So anything that gets them away from death and destruction, economic imperialism, failures, racism, all those kind of issues that are actually most people do associate with the militarized power structures and the securitized power structures of the United States, actually. But if they can cover that up with a layer of icing, both metaphorically and literally, that seems to be part of what they do. Make things all nice and fluffy.
Hi, this is the Ignoramus Guide. I'm Ileana Chan with my co-host Wei. Just Wei for those who can't actually see the video. And we have two very special guests with us today. We have Matt Alford. Matt is here because we are discussing this book by Alan Macleod. Propaganda. I think I said it right. Maybe.
We think it's Alan Macleod, but
Alan Macleod. Which is Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. So it has it's kind of like an anthology, isn't it, of different articles and essays, and it has a pretty amazing interview with Matt Alford in this about essentially the war machine in Hollywood. Matt also did a documentary called Theater of War, which has it been released yet, Matt?
Yeah, Theatre of War came out in May of last year, so May 2022.
So where can our audience watch it now?
You can find it on Vimeo, I think, for about $5. Okay. And if you're a student in the United States, it's on Kanopy for free. Cool. There might be one or two other places as well, but I can't remember. There's also a couple of festival screenings coming up, which I've forgotten as well to list here, but never mind. You could always Google it, couldn't you?
We'll also include it in links below.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be really helpful.
Stuff like that. And Adrian Devant, did I say your name wrong? Because it's
no, that's
correct. Okay, yeah. And Adrian Devant, who is the producer of Ithaka, amongst many things, but that's the main reason we have you on this podcast. So Ithaka, for those of you who do not know, is an amazing documentary about the father of Julian Assange. So these documentaries are actually kind of connected, and they're connected to propaganda because Julian Assange, obviously the victim of ridiculous smears and propaganda, someone who's instrumental in revealing the many, many crimes of the empire and of corporations and the elites and lots of things like that, being smeared and silenced and imprisoned in Belmarsh prison for almost 4 years now. So that is, if anything, the most clear-cut case of a victim of this type of thing. And the Theater of War obviously shows in a very, I think, WikiLeaks way, and in fact, documents forensic evidence that the war machine is actually funding Hollywood in really big ways that maybe most people are not aware of.
Where do we even start? We had some preamble before, didn't we? We were saying how you came to be connected to Matthew and Adrian, and I think that's a really interesting start.
Well, I think it's okay to say, I think it must have been about 2016, I wrote a letter to Julian Assange. I think partly because I genuinely cared about his situation, but also partly because I'd just written a book and I wanted to see if he might endorse it.
What was the book? What is that book, by the way?
I think it was The Writer with No Hands. I think I sent him that. I may have also sent him my first book from 2010, Real Power. I can't remember. But also, I think maybe he wants something to read while he's stuck in this embassy. I'm sure he could get books at the time much more easily than he can now. But so I contacted him. It seemed like a good thing to do. Didn't hear back from him. Didn't particularly expect to. But then it was literally 5 years later, I heard from his wife, Stella Assange, who had evidently gone through old correspondence that had perhaps never even been read. And she sent me a photograph of my letter, which was obviously quite confusing to receive a letter that I've written to the world's most wanted man now from an anonymous number. But I soon established that it was Stella Assange. So from that, Stella was asking, what can you do? What would you like to do? And we talked about the possibility of getting an article about the media representations, and particularly the entertainment industry representations of WikiLeaks. And also, I think wanted for me to write about the representation of Edward Snowden as well, and Elsie Manning as part of that. But we couldn't really do it that easily, partly because there'd been almost all of the explosion of interest from the entertainment industry about Julian Assange all came around about 2013. Then after that, the entertainment industry just went off it, and even news media coverage dropped off precipitously after Julian went to prison in 2019. And it had been tailing off a bit before that as well. I looked at the graph the other day on how that on media coverage of Julian. So from that, even though it was very difficult to write that mainstream article, I did write about it ultimately for the second edition of my book that's coming out in a couple of months. And it also led to me promoting Ithaka with Adrian at a few screenings around universities and in my local cinema. Myself and Adrian have probably only exchanged a few words. Hello, Adrian. I know Nils a bit better, the director, and I've met some of the others at various different events, but that's how I plug into it. And I do agree that there are great overlaps between Theatres of War and Ithaka, with the plight of Julian Assange really being a microcosm of all of the worst aspects of the national security state and that kind of repressive apparatus that is dominating our planet.
Did you find, Adrian, what Matt is talking about, that when the premiere of Ithaka happened, it was kind of this uphill battle to get it into the mainstream consciousness?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's great to be on and be chatting to you all. And thanks for doing this podcast. First of all, I'm not the only producer of Ithaka, so Gabriel Shipton is also the other producer.
One of the producers, sorry. As is Matt, is one of the producers of Theatre of War. Sorry.
No, yeah,
it's all us, but we like to share the credit.
Films like Matt is so important. This research is so important, and to put it out there is so important too, because it's the same thing that you hear lately about whether it's the Twitter files or whether it's like there's always this argument about, oh, well, everybody knew this anyway, like it's all this big conspiracy. But no, like when you actually have proof, like when WikiLeaks provides proof, like when there's research done and backed up and there's evidence that this is going on, that's really important. And it's always I find that it's also part of this deceptive environment that just accept that, oh, well, there's always conspiracies, oh, well, there's everybody already knew this, and you downplay the importance of actual evidence, hard evidence. But anyway, just so an uphill battle. This film started really after, Gabriel often tells the story of when directly after Julian was thrown into Belmarsh, dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy and thrown into Belmarsh. John Shipton, that's Julian's father, the subject of the film, and Gabriel went to see Julian. It was John Pilger. It was the three of them on that particular visit. And Gabriel came away thinking that it was the last time that he might see Julian, because he saw him in such a bad way. And, much the same way that we've all asked ourselves, even, also as members of the family, like, what can we do? Gabriel asked himself, what can he do? And he comes from doing fiction features, world of film. And to him, that was a way that, he could do something, is make a documentary. I'd been in film for some time. We spoke with John, with Stella also came to be part of that. And we started following John, and we followed him for 2.5 years. And by the end of it, we had 200 days of footage. So anyway, just now I deviate, but I'm just trying to paint a picture of where we started out. It was a very, very dark place. And it has been of course, we've knocked on many doors to, get pre-sales or financing. How are we going to get this movie made as well? Cooperation and all of that. And we knocked on the doors of all the big names, all the biggest streaming platforms and all of this. And, we often got like, oh yeah, this is very interesting. But, on the one hand, it's, your family. So that's biased, that's a problem. Why would we can't really put any faith in this biased story.
So basically all the main platforms rejected you based on really kind of ridiculous reasons.
Oh yeah, they said the other aspect, was the political, like, this is not something we want to get in the middle of, that's quote unquote. So obviously there was this other aspect to it. And so that's where we started. That was the, we made the film, all these no's just confirmed that we were on the right track, all these no's. And we ended up making the film. We've been festivals, with the film, we got the audience award, which I think is like really the best award at any festival to get, is like, not the, oh, we're going to invite these people over to our festival because, we have a prize to give them, but like how the audience reacts, right? So at the Human Rights Film Festival of Berlin, we got the audience award. At Soho London Independent Film Festival, we got an audience award. So it has been an uphill battle, but it's also, you also know, the tide is changing and the support for Julian is growing, and all those, the powers that be would have us believe, oh, there's no support for Julian. That's kind of, they still push that. But the truth is that there is this massive support everywhere, and they just don't want you to believe that. It's very easy to say. I was actually looking at this book, Propaganda Blitz. Now I forget.
David Cromwell and David Edwards.
Yes, and it was interesting to see like how the journalistic establishment in the UK like is it's, you can only liken their behavior to like a bunch of bullies on a school playground that gang up and sort of, now we're gonna, even just the language, it's so absurd to sort of, that a journalist should be expressing themselves this way. It's completely, well, unprofessional and just, well, yeah, dangerously childish. Sorry, I've just gone on a completely different tangent here, but
you said one thing that like earlier in the beginning is that I wanted to go back to, because I think it's a really important point. It's like when you were saying about the revelations of the Twitter file, people tend to say, and I was definitely one of them that was like, well, I knew this information before, but I think to me, I knew it before, but I also think I felt like I had certain proof before it had come out. But there's certain things, like, for example, it reminded me of how Agent Orange has been dealt with. Like in the Theater of War documentary, Matt, there was that section where they showed like how Agent Orange, it has actually been acknowledged in the US because there was $180 million payout or something to the vets who were affected by Agent Orange, but it has never been acknowledged in Vietnam. And so it's this thing of like, even if we're saying, oh, everybody knows this, like everybody now, I mean, everybody really knows about Agent Orange, but there's just this real lack of accountability when it's not like evidenced and documented and forensically proved that it happened, because they can just deny it. And for people in the West, sometimes they don't think of people in Vietnam or people in other countries as humans. So they don't realize like the actual cost of what Agent Orange did, It's like, maybe, I mean, having been to Vietnam, go ahead, sorry.
And is continuing to do, as I understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you go there and you actually see someone without limbs or that was somehow affected by that, it's much, I mean, like we shouldn't have to have the actual, but that's it, human evidence in our faces of the cost of that. And then the continual denial, the gaslighting of that denial. That's why evidence matters, essentially. Yeah, so it is really.
I agree. I think that the more evidence that comes out, the better. I think it's very easy for people who aren't necessarily that politically interested or that politically plugged in to say, oh, they're all the same. They're all doing bad things all the time, being really cynical about it. But what good does that do? What good do they do? Ultimately, it's the pressure that is applied by continually having the story on the headlines, and to get the story continually in the headlines, you need to have new evidence and new angles on that story all the time. Just because people know that the United States has done some bad things at X or Y and Z, that's not pressure. That's not sufficient to make any changes. It needs to be sustained, systematic, and accurate information continually coming out in official documentation. And that was exactly what WikiLeaks was doing, and exactly why they were so despised by the establishment. Because if you don't do that, then you have people, there's probably the person living next door to you is probably like, oh, I don't like the government. Oh, they're such rotters, aren't they? Who cares what that attitude's just despondency. That doesn't get us anywhere. People need to be reminded. They need to be reminded of the factual information, but they need to be reminded of the human cost, the human stories that are around that, to make a more humane world. You can't have a more humane world just by saying, oh, everyone's a rotter. That's not going to do any good at all.
Yeah, and coming back to this idea of like, because you're family, Adrian, you're just biased. It's just like, I think that is just one of the ways in which, again, you can dismiss any sort of differing voices. And isn't it kind of related to number 3 on the 5 filters from this book, which is number 3 on this was reliance on information provided by government, big business, and other official experts. And when you have like a really short list of official experts that just happen to be from the State Department, then obviously the most objective, neutral sources of information, all in quotation marks for people only listening to this podcast, are going to be CIA, MI5, State Department narrative people. And so, yeah, you're never going to get like any dissenting voices in that case.
Well, I mean, in our case, it kind of boils down to something more human. Like sure, you can see it through the lens, and I think it's very apt to see it through that lens when we're talking about it as now. But for us, it's just, well, we're family. We want to show this. It's not a campaign per se. It's like we want to show this other story, this other Julian, the Julian of that's a father and a son and a brother, a loving, caring human being. This is another story. There's another side to it. So, I mean, it does, obviously it counters, and it's people come away from the film affected, emotionally affected. I was in the Q&A online just the other day, and this guy was saying, I'm almost weeping and this kind of thing. So people do get affected. And that's what we want. Well, obviously, that's what we set out to do, is to humanize, Julian for people, because everything has been sort of smears and to dehumanize him, right? So
easier than to just lock him up in prison, for how many years if you don't think of him as human. And I do agree with you that Ithaka is very, very emotional, and really I was very moved watching it. It was very profound in a very quiet way, actually, which is not true of a lot of things I watch. I would say I'm a cynical person. So I was really moved by it. It's a beautiful piece of work, I think.
I think underlying the smears against Julian is something quite interesting. I mean, there's been all sorts of smears, as you know, including that he smeared shit on the walls of the embassy, which is just false and nonsensical bunch of nonsense. But at the underlying, the kind of meta narrative of what is informing people's attitude to Julian, I think, is that he's a narcissist. I think that's been a very powerful kind of underlying idea of what he is, because from that springs all of the bad behavior that he is alleged to have done. But it's interesting. I was reading Media Lens the other day, Adrian, like the Propaganda Blitz book, but more up to date article, and they were talking about the use of about how the establishment paints individuals as narcissists when they start to break through and become powerful. There were several examples there, but the 3 that I remember were Jeremy Corbyn, and then perhaps even more so Mick Lynch, union leader who's become famous over the past 6 months or so due to the extended strikes in Britain. And Mick Lynch seems like, to me, a very straight guy, and that's why he's resonated so well with the public. but the media keep painting him and keep asking him the questions like, oh, you must love the limelight. You must love it. This is what it's all about for you, isn't it? This is what it's about. It's getting famous, isn't it? Getting your name up on the paper. And he's just, no. But it seems to be quite. I'm not saying that this is necessarily deliberate in the sense.
Seems deliberate. Come on.
I'm not necessarily saying that it's coordinated, but there seems to be there is a pattern, I think, of presenting people who break through, who are successful. George Galloway was another one who was presented in that way as narcissistic. People who break through to the public. It's the instant reaction from the establishment is, oh, you're doing this for ulterior motive, for your own egocentricity. I remember even The Big Issue. This really annoyed me because obviously The Big Issue is quite a good magazine, and politically, they're not pushing any horrible agenda. But I remember back in 2013, I picked up a copy of The Big Issue, and it was. And the front cover of it was about Julian Assange. It was him in a James Bond pose that they'd put him in. And the headline of the whole thing was "The Spy Who Loved Himself." And I remember thinking they've hit exactly what the people who hate this guy want. That's perfectly. And that essential view of those opponents to the Western national security establishment.
It's such a weird one because I'm actually not sure why it's so effective, and it's
because it touches everything. If you're narcissistic, it means that everything that you ever make is tainted. If I just said that you've got I can't think what it would be. If I just said you've got bad breath or whatever, then that's only one thing. But narcissism runs right along every single aspect, every single choice.
I mean, I would venture to say that. And now I'm going to be like, Wei, is this correct? Because as the other fellow Asian, I actually think it's a very Western framing of something because we have such a quote unquote narcissistic, individualistic culture. And so we sort of project our worst traits, I guess, on people we hate. I mean, right? Like to sort of control that narrative. But it's not something that I really find that resonant outside of our Western. I don't know. Am I wrong, Wei? Like,
I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting point. I haven't really consumed so much Asian media that I would maybe recognize that point, whether they smear people that they don't like as narcissists or not. I don't know. It is a very effective one though, because I suppose it really just it puts all of their actions in that light, I guess. So everybody's able to reframe almost everything that comes out about the target as, an action that's there to feed his own ego, I guess.
Yeah, but I just find it so ineffective for me, I guess, because you could call every single person, every single well-known person is narcissistic. Like you could call anyone, all the neolibs as well, Obama, etc. So, I mean, like, how does it even affect anything? It's more about what are they doing and what are they saying and what do they stand for? I mean, isn't that sort of...
Yeah, but what you're doing there is applying critical thinking, but to the casual observer, the person who's not engaging in that, I think it's quite a very good sort of soft way of saying, oh no, oh that guy, oh right, yeah, well he is very obsessed with him. And there needs to be no evidence for that. It's not saying that person's evil or that person's sadistic or that person was cruel to their mother or anything like that. Nothing specific. It just taints everything. And that's what they did with Corbyn, although they went a little bit more specific with the anti-Semitism story. Again, depends who you want to, where did that come from? Is it always from exactly the same people? I'm not saying that, but it's an interesting pattern of how to smear people. I think it's a very effective one. I don't know if it does work outside of the Western civilization, but certainly to me, that's what's happened with those people. And they were important figures, or maybe still are important figures, who could have broken through and done a lot of good, and to some extent they have. But
I mean, I think it would work if it was just repeated over and over again, like anywhere. I don't think it's as much of a buzzword catchphrase right now. That's the culture. But you're definitely right in that. That's what you hear about Putin as well. Like you hear about almost every any enemy of the US, I suppose, or the empire.
That is kind of true, actually. You do hear about Xi Jinping as well, that they'll say stuff, or Kim Jong-un and they'll always say, you know, he's very sensitive about his hair, or he's very sensitive about Winnie the Pooh, or you know, something like that. So it does seem like quite a common narrative, I think.
Yeah, because it's completely sidesteps any geopolitics, any dynamics, and anything, just makes it about a personal petty squabble. So I guess it's distracting for people. And it's I think the same happened with Julian. It's because then now no one's talking about the WikiLeaks revelations, I guess, or keeping war criminals accountable. Yeah. I think the other thing too, and we sort of touched upon this a little bit earlier, Matt, like maybe our only point of disagreement, let's go, is kind of and I think I'm putting words in your mouth, so you're probably going to be like, I did not mean
I know
it
you
that
want
way.
this conflict. But
No, you wanted conflict. That's our first conflict. But essentially this idea of that both sides are sort of equal. The U.S. imperialism. There's a lot of this stuff. Like when people sometimes look at WikiLeaks, they're like, well, but it just revealed the war crimes of the U.S. Like it just went after the U.S. You know, like really, if it went after every country equally, we would all be the same. Like there's that narrative there. There's a kind of like the narrative of like, if it's not the U.S. empire, you know, then it will be China or Russia taking the place of the U.S. empire. And I think that's one of actually the most dangerous parts of this propaganda. We're just like, instead of keeping ourselves accountable for what we're doing, you know, our argument is like, well, if we didn't rape that woman, someone else would. It just is the most stupid argument, even on the face of it. And then when we actually get into it, which is like, there are no other countries that are even comparable to the US empire in terms of the military machine. There's nothing comparable. Not even, we're talking about like less than 20 military bases compared to 1,000 military bases. I mean, that's like a ridiculous discrepancy. So obviously you're not disagreeing with that. I'm saying maybe where we kind of have a slight disagreement is like with kind of the framing around the Ukraine proxy war. I feel quite strongly that we shouldn't be phrasing things in the way of like, well, it's a war between two imperialist powers and Russian expansionism versus US expansionism.
Yes, that is a difficult one because I think really and I'm reluctant to be drawn on it. And I can remember the other thing that we slightly disagreed about when we've talked before, which I'll get onto if you like. But I'm reluctant to be drawn on it because I think a lot of that, as soon as you start to take a position that is so firm on the Ukraine issue, I think that's when you start to fall into one ideological zone or another. Obviously, I'm anti-war. I'm very much pro-peace and negotiation within Ukraine. But I don't think I know, and I know that 99.9% of people who are outside of Russia and Ukraine do not know that country, those two countries and those two political systems perfectly enough to know exactly how to characterize events on the ground. I've been speaking to a PhD candidate in Moscow. I've been questioning her again and again and again about territory in Ukraine, and eventually she was like, I don't know either. I've been here for 30 odd years and I don't know the answer to the exact so I'm just a bit wary of that particular thing. And I think it's enough to say that and it's accurate enough to say that what Russia did in February of last year was an act of aggression. It was illegal, it was wrong, it was an escalation, and I do think that should be condemned. Whether we call that, I'm certainly reluctant to call that imperialism. I think that's imperialism implies something much more structural and the building of empire. But nevertheless, it is an act of great power aggression. But also, again, within the context of NATO behaving appallingly for the past 30 years. So I think I'm a bit reluctant to say that it's to sort of go further than that in terms of the.
Yeah, I think that's the main difference between us. Also, I think to me, it, you know, again, number 4 on the 5 filters, which is flack. And we had a little disagreement with this too. Like, I think a lot of this weighing of your words about talking about Russia, you know, looking at the minute map of Russia territory, etc., is very much because, as anybody in the West, if you just come out and say, look, NATO's expansion, the provocation of this war, the escalation of this war because of the war machine and the US empire's need for hegemony, that is really the cause of the war. And when you look at it geopolitically, that's what we're faced with. Whether we're looking at Russia or China, the escalation of these war tactics is what we're looking at. Like, if
Well,
you just come out.
I think it's fair to say that on almost every occasion, in almost every conflict around the world, the United States is the organization which is escalating. But I just mean, I think it would be fraudulent to say that in February, at least on that particular part of February 2022, that it was the United States that escalated. Russia did escalate at that point. I'm not saying that.
I guess I disagree with that part. I think that US definitely escalated it. I think they did. They provoked it. They escalated. They knew what they were doing. They wanted this war.
Do you think in the week running up to it, or the weeks running up to it, when they were saying, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade,
yep.
Do you think, because I'm on the fence about this, do you think that was a way to deter Russia from invading?
No,
do you think
that was a way to cover their asses,
putting more pressure on the whole situation?
No, I think that was a way to cover their asses, because they learned from the Iraq War. They learned from the anti-war protests there, and they killed it. Go ahead, Adrian.
No, that's something that I was about to pick up on. It's like, maybe, to my shame, I didn't go into, I wasn't tuned into the ins and outs of all that moment of Ukraine. I have followed it, but not in depth as I've followed many other things. And to me, what's chilling is to see the absence of like the war movement as there was before. That raises the hairs on the back of my neck, because it feels like the war machine, or whatever, they've learned so well how to deal with that. Yeah. I mean, there was no Colin Powell sitting at a table at the UN saying, we need your backup for this, or the equivalent thereof, and therefore no space. I mean, also within time and physically for people to sort of react, to sort of coalesce and say, wait, hang on a second, what the hell's going on here? And
yeah, the extension hijacked it.
I found it very disturbing I think about 2 weeks after the invasion. I thought that there would be calls for peace from the Stop the War coalition. And indeed, Stop the War did arrange a protest throughout the country, and I went to the one in my city. But when I got there, Stop the War wasn't even there. I mean, I think there was one guy who was literally one old bloke with a banner. Everyone else, the other 2,000 plus people who were there to oppose Russian aggression.
Exactly. So I think that's what it is.
I found that very disturbing, because, I mean, regardless of who's right or wrong, or who's escalated at any particular point, that's part of the whole principle of the anti-war movement of the past 50 plus years, is to de-escalate. And there are always ways of finding ways. There are always ways to do that through diplomacy. I think that there's been this weird, this appalling thing, which is the idea that appeasement, or that diplomacy is somehow equals appeasement. One of the most disgusting gifts that Adolf Hitler gave us, I think, is this idea that we always need to escalate, because that's the only way to. The head of NATO the other day, didn't he? Said the way to peace is through weapons. I mean, that passes without comment, except for on the fringes.
Yeah.
That's the kind of world that we have allowed to develop after having a much better international sense of international law and international peace and justice running up to the 1970s. But we've allowed that to fall apart completely. Extraordinarily dangerous and disturbing, and really,
I don't even know if I really believe in that now. I think, looking back at my incredible ignorance, because we did the Jakarta method on our podcast.
Oh yeah.
So my incredible ignorance about that time period, pre-1970s, and the rule of law or whatever that apparently the US and the UK is in charge of, and has very kindly given to the rest of us colonized nations. I don't even believe in that anymore. I think we're just propagandized to think that we had moral authority, but we never really did.
I think all I'm saying, Ileana, is I'm not saying that our countries were great or anything like that back in the 60s and 70s. I'm just saying that there were international treaties that were keeping some semblance of stability between, at the very least, the great powers. And after you recommended it, I've got out the Jakarta method as well from the library, and I've been having a look at that today. But so I'm completely aware that there are all these abuses going on throughout the world. I'm just saying that there was a sense, there was a peace movement for a start that was meaningful and could do something, and that was sometimes attached to socialist groups and to trade unions and all sorts. But there were also international treaties, arms control treaties. These have all been jettisoned over the past, particularly over the past 6 to 7 years. But even before that, there have been these kind of any kind of semblance of international law and international stability through treaties just been annihilated since the 90s.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm so against that specific framing of always going to, well, which territories is Russia going after? Like the aggressive expansion of Russia and da da da. And it's just like it's missing the forest for the trees, because if we know that NATO is escalating, we're part of NATO. That's what we should be focusing on. When you do the other thing, it's not even, okay, it's not because I'm like pro-Russian invasion. No, it's because why are we talking about that when we have a much bigger, so my I guess real disagreement with you is that it's actually a trap to fall into looking at the map and trying to figure out the treaty of the border lines or whatever, because it's a complete distraction from what is really going on, which is NATO trying to escalate this war. NATO now, or the US really, now talking about, and this has always been like part of their plan to get to China, right? It's that whole stopping the multipolar world situation.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me say that I definitely don't want to fall into that trap. I just wanted all I want to do is acknowledge it. So let me stop falling into that trap and continue with the discussion away from that. I'm very happy to concede that point to you. But I was reading, it was literally just this morning, though, an article in the press about the disagreements within the American administration at the moment. The reason that there are some parts of the State Department that want to win and escalate the war against Russia, and then there are those parts that want to de-escalate and deal with it. But the reason that they want to de-escalate is so that they can focus on China.
Exactly.
I mean, that is how insane.
That's why I'm always like, when people say there is
those are the peaceniks, the ones who actually
there are no peaceniks. There are no peaceniks in the US admin. Yeah. There's not really dissenting voices in the same way that we think of it outside of that contraction or whatever. But yeah, that's I guess that is the thing, that we can consistently fall into that trap, and mainly because in the West, to say anything different, the flack is really extreme. I mean, we're talking about no to NATO event being canceled twice already, Conway Hall being one. So we know that even our most supposed, I don't know, stop the war, like all these voices that are the ones that we, I guess, have historically depended on to be our moral compass, or they're also facing flack maybe, or maybe they really do believe in the whole Russia aggression thing. But I think it was a trap laid by, as you were saying, 2 weeks before the war, US keeps pivoting, like changing the frame to be like Russia is the aggressor, Russia is going to invade, etc. So just like Russia is the aggressor, Russia's going to invade, and the anti-war people were like, no, they don't want war, they don't want da da da. And so when they invaded, it just completely took the wind out of any anti-war sails. And then suddenly they're like, oh no, does that mean I'm for war? So they changed their position and essentially completely destroyed the actual real anti-war movement, because they didn't, keep they fell into that trap. They got lost in the trap, and now we're suffering the consequences of that, which is, like you're saying, there's very, very few people that actually are holding NATO responsible and trying to de-escalate the war.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's consider some of those things that NATO has been involved in escalation or refusing to de-escalate. And one of the most significant ones was in April of last year, when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain, went to Ukraine and told President Zelensky, even if you are prepared to negotiate, the collective West is not.
Right.
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's changed a bit now because Biden, I think I read a couple of days ago, has basically said, give away. I mean, they're all talking about a carve up now behind the scenes. They weren't, they didn't want to. It was all to do. Oh, it's Ukraine's decision. Now
Right.
they're talking about a carve up, and that's of course what will happen. It always was going to be what has happened. But that that was Boris Johnson's position, and obviously he would have been representing the Americans and I guess the rest of NATO there as well. There were opportunities even into the war to de-escalate, but this war has been a long time coming. It's not just that post-1990s demonization of Russia, but it's also that this has all been played up against is called by critics Russiagate, and is called more laboriously Russian interference in American elections by people who think that there's some credibility to this nonsensical story about Putin's memes somehow getting Trump elected in 2016. But that's the backstory to this whole thing. That's the kind of meta narrative, if you like, which is that that Russia is somehow this enormously powerful organized country which is able to topple governments simply with the press of a button.
It's like 100,000, I think, of Facebook advertising.
$100,000 Facebook advertising, and it's done nothing. Russiagate, which I think it is fair to call it that, but I know a lot of serious people and friends and colleagues who believe this, and to me, it's the stupidest conspiracy. Talk about conspiracy theories. I mean, talk about harmful conspiracy theories. I mean, who gives a shit if you believe that whatever happened to President Kennedy? But this one has provided more than the mood music, really, for this massive war. Really, the entire background apparatus for the sort of mental apparatus to justify this conflict. There's no need to be fighting with Russia. Like, I mean, there is no, and it's a very weak country. This is the other thing that we keep forgetting collectively. A country like Russia is extraordinarily weak. It cannot do anything. It cannot click a button and make the memes get Trump in. That doesn't happen. It didn't happen. It's the very fact that we think that it can even consider that it may have happened is an indication of how weak they are and how powerful the Western national security.
Yeah, as if the US hasn't couped governments across the world.
So all of that is Russia's economy is about the size of Italy's. I mean, I've seen it go up and down a little bit around those figures, but it's a weak country. It's not an expansionist country, except for that it does want to deal with what it considers to be security issues on its border. What it considers to be security issues.
I mean, I would say one thing that is different for me about Russia and China, like if we were to look at this Ukraine proxy war or US proxy war really as like sort of inevitable, I think sometimes people say that. And I would say, I think it might have been inevitable in terms of because of the way that Russia is sort of set up. It is military operational, it does sort of intervene, maybe it's the wrong word, but it has military operations across the world, etc. I would say differently about China. So now that we, as you mentioned, the narrative is going to slowly pivot towards China now, as you're hearing quote unquote dissension in the American government. So we're going to be hearing more and more stories, and they've already started. We're talking about.
Yeah, well, there was a balloon that went over America.
Right.
It's me. Are
Very
we all afraid?
balloon.
First the memes from Vladimir Putin, and then the balloon. The balloon.
Have you heard anything about the balloon way in like Asia?
I also watched it recently, and it is that horror clown, and one of his trademarks is a big red balloon. So you
Maybe
kind
it was
of
a
see
Chinese balloon because it was red.
It was red, yeah. No, it was a white balloon. The Chinese balloon was white, but I think in the memes it was red as well. So it made me think maybe there's like a horror clown behind, like ready to like grab some children or something like that.
Fair. That's again, but that is propaganda way that you've fallen for again. Propaganda in Hollywood.
Oh yeah.
Clown was scary because he lived in a drain. This balloon, it's 30,000 feet up in the air, not attached to a killer clown.
Are you guys feeling at all the anti-China propaganda ramping up? I mean, I was trying to think like maybe I'm feeling it more because I'm biased being Chinese. But do you guys feel that as well? Or is it just like sometimes I think, oh, this is so clearly, propaganda, anti-Chinese propaganda. You don't need to be scared in this balloon situation if you were kind of secretly a little bit scared of Chinese people. But a lot of people just think they're factual, and I guess that's how propaganda works. But do you guys feel like any sort of ramping up? Have you noticed anything like that?
It's funny because I co-founded this Chinese independent film festival in Spain, and it's funny because it was 2000. The first edition was in 2017, and we did I think 3 editions before COVID, and we had Chinese stars and directors, producers come over to Spain. It was great, but at the time, especially on the second edition where we were also in Madrid, not just Barcelona, but like the doors were flung open to us. There's the One Belt, One Road initiative, all of this. Like there was a lot of interest from big institutions to talk about the possibilities of collaborating. So there was like a lot of opening up. That seems to have evaporated. So
really,
things that like I'm very much that gets my blood boiling, which is like you sort of demonize like all there's like a cultural demonization as well. Like, oh, so you're going to stop engaging and sort of, well, whatever it is, whether it's soft power, all of this, like that's an important part of like othering people is to not even engage culturally. And what I was going to say about what gets my blood boiling with at the beginning of the Russia conflict, like there were Russian conductors being fired. Oh, we won't watch Tarkovsky. It's off our things. Like, let's ban Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. It's like, what absolute madness! Like, what the hell are we talking about? So that gets me really angry. And precisely, I think that's one of the important things to do is to precisely build bridges through culture, through understanding, through our common humanity, right? Like so the film festival for me wasn't that's what it was doing. It was bringing people together to watch Chinese film. There were independent Chinese films. I mean, I'd also been to festivals where there was like the state pavilion and you flip through the catalog and it was just pretty abysmal. Like there's 150 films and they were all like I'd never heard of them, or my mates hadn't heard of them, and they were just garbage. Surely now's the time to learn Chinese. Now's the time to learn Russian. Now's the time to try and bridge the things that make sense, that can bring people together.
Are you trying to say that Kung Fu Yoga was not a culturally valuable film?
Which one? Kung Fu Panda?
Yoga.
I think it was one that coincided with a Modi Xi Jinping state visit or something like that, and
wow,
Kung Fu Yoga starring Jackie Chan on the Kung Fu side, and then a major Bollywood star on the yoga side.
Is this real?
It's real. It's hilarious.
Oh wow, I want to watch this film.
You should
get
watch
some
it,
China,
actually.
India.
It's definitely entertaining. Yeah,
that's great.
Propaganda.
Good propaganda, maybe.
It was good propaganda. It was both. It was two nations coming together.
Yeah.
I think the soft power argument was weaponized more against Russia. Like I haven't seen it as much against China. Although Rishi Sunak, I think, did before he was prime minister, say something really strong about wanting to close all the Confucius institutes.
Yes.
In the
UK. So it is, and then the other thing is TikTok. Like the US keeps trying to shut down TikTok, even though it's also foreign owned. So that's kind of hilarious.
That's not soft power, though. I think that's more just because TikTok doesn't really promote any.
But they're saying it does, I think.
Yeah. I think they were saying something ridiculous, like it siphons off data.
Oh yeah.
The data of Americans to China or something.
Yeah, that's true. They were also saying that.
But yeah, the soft power stuff as well. I mean, I think it's they were also, I saw some furore on the internet about there was a Soviet architecture exhibition.
Oh yeah.
And there was a hit piece against the architecture exhibition saying that this is going to increase Russian soft power. And then I think it turned out to be someone who was just writing a hit piece about his Russian ex-girlfriend who was actually in charge of the exhibition, and he kind of alleged in his piece that, or he got a reporter to allege in the piece that she had ties to Putin or something like that, something ridiculous, which they withdrew.
Oh, that's interesting. The plot thickens.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah, so if you have an ex-partner that you want to get your own back on and they happen to be Russian, then this is your time, I guess.
Link them to Vladimir Putin. Yeah, the plot thickens, but it doesn't mean that the plot's any good, does it?
No. Speaking of, that's a pivot to Hollywood. And back to the book. Yay, I did it. An amazing segue.
Well done.
Congratulate yourself off air.
Not on air, damn it. Yeah, well, I think that was some of the revelations in this book and in Theatre of War about the vast funding of films by the military-industrial complex. Were any of the films sort of surprising to you guys? Like, I think I should ask Wei and Adrian, because Matt, I don't know. I don't know if anything was surprising to you, Matt. Maybe you can tell me.
Yeah.
If you look at it for long enough, it all stops being surprising.
Exactly. I'm assuming you worked on it for a while, so it's no longer surprising.
It's surprising to begin with. I mean, it was surprising the extent to which the national security state influenced the products, and that was I mean, I would have probably have given up doing research around about 2014, 2015, because I'd done all the things I wanted to do academically, and like theoretically with the work I'd done on Chomsky and all that. It was only because me and Tom Secker got that list of films that were supported by the Department of Defense, which at the time there was a list of about 1,000 or so, which was still much higher than the official figure. And that figure is now ballooned to more like 10,000 if you include TV series and stuff. So when we got that, that has basically propelled the last probably 7, 8, 9 years of my work. I don't think I would have continued as a researcher or a documentary maker if it hadn't been for that. So that really was a genuine. We were really surprised by that, and I think everyone would be. That's another one of those cases where, you know, everyone says afterwards, as we were saying at the beginning, everyone says, "Oh, well, I always knew that the government did." And no, you didn't. You didn't ever know that.
I mean, the thing is, and that's why we know.
To sound like, you know, that's a lot of people do that because they don't want to feel out of control, and they don't want to feel that they didn't get the answer right, and they don't want to feel that.
Yeah, but I think
they want to normalize it.
They want to normalize it.
No, and it's bloody awful.
Well, the thing was that was really interesting about the documentary, though, was that even though I did know this, Matt, the changing of the facts were just really, I mean, obviously I wouldn't know the facts on the ground in these war operations that, you know, they changed for, was it the Discovery Network? They had History Channel or something. They had like a series and they just changed like key facts. And then that really famous movie by Peter Berg called Lone Survivor, which when I saw the trailer for that, I refused to watch that. I was like, this looks like propaganda. And then sure enough, like, because they changed these like really key pieces of information, I think that is really helpful because, like you said, yeah, I could go like, oh, this is war propaganda, that is war propaganda. And it's obvious for me, but it's still impactful, especially for that History Channel TV series where they really maligned the peace activist who committed suicide because of what he experienced during the war, I guess you could say.
The Long Road Home, the miniseries, yeah. Was it Discovery Channel or was it
History Channel?
I can't remember that, but that's mentioned.
I mean, the key thing is that it was a channel that's supposedly more factual, rather than that's actually so horrific. The way that, obviously I don't like, it's like, I don't want to be that meme that goes around where it's like, where they show the atrocities that the US has committed, and they're saying, not only will the US invade your country, they'll make a movie about how hard it was for their soldiers 20 years later. I don't want to be that person, but I think
that person is the comedian Frankie Boyle, who I think rather hit the nail on the head when he did it back in 2014.
You're right. Good credit where it's due. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to be that, but it did really highlight just how horrendously their veterans are also being treated.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing about that was that, I mean, obviously, usually I think the focus should be on overseas victims, because they're so regularly killed in such large numbers. But on that particular case, the Long Road Home, which we show in detail for about 20 minutes of the documentary, how those changes were made. They were screwing over their own soldiers. Yes. Really explicitly,
and they always do that.
Interviews the real soldiers, and they can't believe it. They're absolutely gutted that the people that they worked with are being misrepresented so horrendously. And in fact, even the military advisor, who was on the production, ends up being the hero of the series.
What a coincidence!
Amazing.
How blatant! I mean, but there are a lot of examples like that are comparably blatant. But that one was pretty striking, and it was one that we really chased down, because Roger, the executive producer of the film and the director and narrator, he actually went to go and see these people, and so he was really able to go into that in a very granular way, and investigate it and speak to them personally, and then put them on camera. And they're very sympathetic, lovely, kind of like these poor military guys, and no one had done that before. But it's on so many of these cases, it's just jaw dropping. But anyway, I don't know if there were any examples that anyone else thought of. I just was filling in there.
No, definitely, really, really, really shocking. The Ellen DeGeneres show.
Right.
Well, et cetera, et cetera. There was a long list of them that, that were still quite surprising to see in there.
Yeah, like the reality shows, right? They also have to get sent to the
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of cake shows. I'm not sure if we've discussed that before off air, but there's a lot of cookery shows that the military likes to associate itself with, and indeed the CIA as well. I can't remember, was it Cake Boss? I think that the CIA got them to like the waiters had to come round to feed the heads of the CIA, and then
oh my God.
I think it was Cake Boss, and then before dessert, the head of the CIA has to go off is whisked away for important business. Now, we don't really know if that was genuine or if it was just like made to make it look like
not genuine. Come on.
God damn it. But there's a lot of this kind of association with food and with cakes, so that you have military and I can't remember what the details of the Ellen show were. To be honest with you, sometimes the information that we have is not at script level. It's only at the level of like memos. So you just have a few lines sort of summarizing how the military's been involved. But often I think they like to be associated with food because it's such a benign and sort of nice thing. So anything that gets them away from death and destruction, economic imperialism, failures, racism, all those kind of issues that are actually most people do associate with the militarized power structures and the securitized power structures of the United States, actually. But if they can cover that up with a layer of icing, both metaphorically and literally, that seems to be part of what they do. Make things all nice and fluffy.
Yeah, I actually have now discovered a disagreement I have with myself, which is that I said before that
I agree with that disagreement.
The Frankie Boyle I think that is very, very, very true. However, if I somehow suggested that we should downplay what the veterans go through, or because having lived in the States, I think one of the things that is almost like nobody is allowed to argue with, or no one does, is the support the troops. It's like stupid stuff you see in like Coffee Bean or Starbucks, and they're like, support the troops and buy coffee or whatever, like a thing. They always have this thing, and it's just so uncritical. They only support the troops to send them to war, or they don't support the troops when they come back, and they certainly don't support any of the consequences of what sending them to war is. So I guess that was
I agree.
emphasized.
Actually, there are organisations, ones like Veterans for Peace.
Yes.
Which I would agree with their perspective probably on geopolitics, but they're also their focus is on domestic Western soldiers who have been sent out and lied to. And in the end, Vietnam was a case where millions of people died in Asia, and only 58,000 American servicemen. But there's the six-figure number of people who are injured out of that as well. So it did devastate the American society as well. And I guess I can see why Frankie Boyle, for example, had that take on things when throughout the 80s and 90s in particular, which would be when he was kind of growing up and becoming politically aware. Actually, the United States didn't lose any troops anywhere, and that was because of what was called the Vietnam syndrome, which was the complete reluctance to lose anyone, to have anyone get into a body bag after Vietnam. They didn't want to be sucked into conflict, which is a good thing, generally speaking, for the world. But by the time just after 9/11, that stopped becoming such a thing. A lot of American servicemen did die service personnel did die in Iraq, for instance. It was a very different conflict.
It wasn't like the Vietnam War. I remember this movie, I think by Aaron Sorkin, that like something 5. Do you remember that movie with not Borat, but Sacha Baron Cohen? I think Sacha Baron Cohen.
Film
Chicago 5 or something like that. Or 7.
The Chicago 5, the one about the when he's Herbie Hoffman, the protester.
Yes,
I've seen that. I don't remember that well enough to comment on. I'm not.
There was just this one part where they were watching the names of casualties on the TV, which is something we would never do now, obviously, because there are no, acknowledgement of American casualties.
Yes, we don't do casualties.
Right.
I mean, there's a great little hypocrisy or lie. I mean, the Americans said that for many, many years. We don't do casualty figures. And now the Russians have been saying we don't do casualty figures. And then, of course, our side is like, oh, the Russians are so barbaric. They're the only ones who don't care. And it's like, well, we did that, actually. Throughout all my life, the Americans specifically said that they would not do casualty figures. And so there were only ever these sort of unofficial estimates.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we have a lot of projection, though, to be fair. Almost everything we accuse anyone of, we're most likely doing.
I'm curious kind of how, because from what I understand with the big budget movies like Top Guns and whatever it is, that the Pentagon have exert leverage over Hollywood by having all these lovely toys and like tanks and planes and things like that, and they say if you want to use these great things in your movie, then we get a say in these edits, or we get ultimately a lot of say in these edits. But I wonder how that works with things like the Ellen DeGeneres Show or Home Alone 3, as you mentioned.
The answer to that is at present we have not quantified the results to that. Someone at some point should make graphs and present data that shows the level of involvement somehow of the US government in all of these different shows, and then somehow plot them on graphs. But you've got to remember that in the end, we've acquired whatever it is, about 40,000 pages of documentation, and then we're starting to put that through databases now, particularly again Roger and Tom, as I understand it. I think they're leading on that at the moment. And then then we've been doing this documentary and publicizing this out of it, and we did this book as well, me and Tom. And so there's just some things that we don't know the exact patterns for that. I suspect that what we'll find with things like Cake Boss and the Ellen DeGeneres show, and some other courtesy support that the military is given, sometimes it's perhaps not that important. And maybe they haven't changed narratives, or maybe they haven't even changed scripts. It's just kind of courtesy stuff. They're just, for example, sometimes military personnel appear on game shows. And then they might have some cheesy thing like, they're reunited with their bomb dog or something like that, the minefield sniffer dog or something like that. Or maybe they'll be hooked up with a call to their wife if they're in if they're deployed, if they've been deployed in Afghanistan or something. So there are these kind of things, but you might just see that as like, well, it's the TV, making a nice story, and that's kind of okay. Maybe it's feel good, whatever. It's not necessarily the end of the world. So I do think that when that's being done as a pattern, it's still generally speaking a bad thing. The fact that apparatus is there makes it propaganda apparatus. But sometimes those things might be more benign than others. The ones that are really concerning are when there are root and branch changes made to whole scripts, or indeed where a film could not actually be produced without the military being involved, and then particularly when that film is being extremely hostile to a foreign power. I mean, Top Gun. You just mentioned Top Gun 2, for example. I mean, they don't mention it by name, but that is a movie that basically endorses, through every aspect of the script and of the visual scenery, endorses Tom Cruise going to bomb an Iranian nuclear facility. I mean,
yeah,
there's an example, but there are many, many examples of very, very heavy-handed involvement or even changes made, and that's on things like like I say, anything to do with lost nuclear weapons, anything to do with racism or mental illness in the army, or suicidal ideation in the military, or every possible conceivable thing. But yeah, there probably are some cases where it's perhaps a bit more benign, and I wouldn't necessarily oppose that.
I mean, I guess I would oppose that because
yeah, I thought you might.
Yes, because just thinking about it, I can't remember what channel Ellen DeGeneres is on, but thinking about the part you highlighted in the documentary about NCIS and how they actually came in with a specific storyline to try to show that rape in the military is really not such a big deal. It's only like a few bad apples type of storyline that they put forth. Just thinking about that, like, I think if you think about it in terms of network, and that's probably why, therefore you have soft power on all these different levels. And also NCIS is one of, I think it's the top paying show. So like, that means that I have a friend who had like a one line on that show, and she basically paid her bills for a whole year. So it's like, yeah, the residuals you get off that show, because it's syndicated, it's been, running for like over a decade, probably. Like, you're getting like so many residuals from that show. That means that it's so ubiquitous, So in that way, I think it's really hard. Like, if you just took it out and siloed Ellen DeGeneres show, but it's obviously not going to be like that. The rest of the network is going to be involved in this too. So it is not benign. I don't think it's benign at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's systematic. I guess I'm not. Yeah, I guess I'm not saying that it's benign. I'm just saying that some productions are more malign than others.
And it seems benign, I think, but accumulative.
Yeah,
you're coming away with that.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if there was a reform in the way that this system operated, and it still allowed for there being some kind of military liaison, I think that wouldn't necessarily be a bad outcome in terms of like proper democratic procedures and accountability and all that. I don't think that the entire practice necessarily needs to be destroyed root and branch.
But I guess
there are organizations like, well, I was going to say the FBI, but actually the FBI are quite bad as well, really. But they're not as bad as the CIA and Department of Defense. And similarly with the police forces as well, NYPD and
I was actually going to say that
they're still quite bad.
They're quite bad. And also that part in the documentary where you talked about, there was this film with Lawrence Fishburne in it, and it was about racism in the military.
Oh, yes.
What was that called? I don't remember what that was called.
Was it Men of Honor?
Was it? I haven't watched it. Yeah.
It was dealing with historic racism in World War II, wasn't it?
Yeah, and they made it like again.
Way, yeah.
Again, like a few bad apples, and obviously not the top people.
Yeah.
It just really reminded me of like this movie by Spike Lee, the Black KK Klansman.
Was that the one set in Vietnam?
No, it was about the KKK. It was the Black Klansman
comedy. In the last 3 years, I think it's just called Black Klansman, isn't it? But
but it has like KKK in there, so you know it's about the KKK, I guess. And I just always thought, I'm wondering if that also had a military police funding, because it had the same thing where they turned it at the end to make it seem like, oh, it's only this one racist cop, but actually the other ones are okay. You know,
that would be very interesting, because I wouldn't have thought that Spike Lee, as a very independent,
I wouldn't either,
would permit that. I mean, there are some of these filmmakers who do have the ability, the clout. Oliver Stone being another, Spike Lee.
But I think
operate independently.
Spike Lee may have turned. I think he endorsed Kamala Harris, though.
I think there are,
Who knows?
Plugged into the mainstream things at various times, hasn't he? The Democrat Party, and so I don't know, but we haven't looked at that one, unfortunately.
I may be smearing him, so
yeah.
Just FYI. Speaking of smears. Okay, cool. So is there anything else that we should cover? Because I feel like we've been talking for a while. We've been covering quite a few things. Oh, wait, did you not want to talk about Marvel?
No, I was gonna say, well, yeah, I mean, I was saying, I did see something the other day talking about how David Graeber wrote something about superhero movies, maybe back in 2013. He wrote like an article, and I think at the time, The Dark Knight was the biggest, it was that, it wasn't Marvel, it was the Christopher Nolan Batman stuff that was like the biggest thing going, and he was kind of writing about those in that context and saying that it's nothing, well, it's only tangentially related, but he was kind of saying how these superhero movies tend to really be pro the status quo. They don't use their, they tend not to ever use their powers for to change society in any way. Well, obviously Bruce Wayne's a billionaire and things like that, and he just spends all his time making these high-tech weapons so that he can, hurt criminals who try and overturn things. And a lot of the time, the criminals are people who actually kind of make really good points. So generally, want to I don't know, want
to destroy the system.
Address societal injustice, but then they do something really crazy, like halfway through, like kill loads of people, and they go quote unquote crazy, and then the story invites the viewer to obviously dismiss the villain, and obviously the only way to go ahead is to side with Batman or whatever, and this person was kind of updating it to talk about Marvel movies and like things like Black Panther and stuff, and the plotline in Black Panther was that I think actually the bad guy or the villain had a really, really good point about like injustice and racism and things like that, but he kind of goes crazy halfway through, and then Black Panther has to kill him. So it kind of reminded me of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's perhaps something inherently conservative about superhero films. I kind of feel that everyone knows superhero films so well that there'll be a bunch of kids watching this who will interpret things more sharply than I will. But I would, I'd chuck in that I mean, that Batman film, for instance, which was a brilliant film, to be fair. At least it was good, The Dark Knight. But I think it was that one where surveillance society comes in, and ultimately Batman and Michael Caine, his butler, who's been part of like British imperialist rule as well. They decide to surveil all of society and they know that they will then destroy the surveillance equipment afterwards, because they're so righteous, and that's kind of like it's not explicit, but it's kind of saying, this is what, in a democratic society, this is what we do. We collect data, and that might be a bit invasive, but it's for your own good. And then don't worry, we will get rid of all that data afterwards. And that's kind of what that film was implying. But I wouldn't like to criticize too heavily the Batman series around that time, because at least it was a decent movie.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame to compare it to it's kind of insulting. Yeah.
But if you read Trisha Jenkins and Tom Secker's book on superheroes movies in the state, they go through all of the documentation on that, which is a little bit more updated than mine and Tom's book. They go through the documentation to show. Whoa, my video's gone funny. They show the documentation, for instance, to show that the whole Iron Man franchise began as an anti-war production, an anti-war narrative.
Oh wow! Can you imagine?
Thematically turned 180 degrees. Now, me and Tom kind of knew that for a while, because we had some of the early documentation, but he subsequently acquired more things that were really able to piece together exactly how that happened and why it happened, and with Pentagon involvement. Sorry, my video keeps going weird. So there's a good example, but a load of the Marvel films have been worked on by the DoD. It's just all a disgrace, really.
Yeah, I really remember thinking that Mickey Rourke's character, the baddie, had such a good point in that movie. So this explains a lot of it.
One of them is called Infinity Wars, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, but it's and just thinking about Julian's situation, it's also you wonder why the entertainment industry hasn't come up in more force. The writing's on the wall about Julian's case, like about what a pivotal moment this is, how this extradition case is decisive, sets a precedent, and so on. But it's in the same way. All these actors, they could be the face. They could easily speak up for Julian, and in the public's eye, that would be huge. That would be huge. Christian Bale, Benedict Cumberbatch, who's played Julian in that film that was bad.
As a narcissist, right? He played him as a narcissist.
Adrian, I don't know if I'm sure you've seen the letters between Julian and Benedict Cumberbatch. I only read them quite recently because for the new introduction to to the reissue of my book, I decided to look more carefully at the discussion between Benedict Cumberbatch and Julian Assange, because I kind of thought at the time, when I'd casually read it, I thought, well, Benedict Cumberbatch is probably just doing his best and all that. But I really looked carefully at the language that he had used, and actually by the end of it, I came out thinking this is a bit of a slime, really.
What was his point? Like, what was his reason?
What Julian was trying to do with Cumberbatch was to say, look, honestly, don't be part of this thing. It's going to be a propaganda. It's going to promote lies and deception. So I'm asking you as a human being, don't do it. I mean, people should check out the letters. They're a really fascinating exchange of two men at the height of their careers and their powers, as one being perhaps the best journalist, the most innovative journalist in the world, and the other one being one of the most famous actors in the world, and well respected as a star as well. But it was quite interesting that although they both make points, I think, that sort of sound legitimate, ultimately there was a few things that Cumberbatch said which I just thought was so interesting about the way that he viewed what he was doing. So, for instance, he talks about how he can't possibly be a mouthpiece for propaganda because the money wasn't worth it. You know, the money wasn't sufficient to make that worth it. It's like as if I'd be a shill for right-wing propaganda. It's like, yeah, well, okay, but it's a very shallow way of looking at it. It's like, and he said, well, I've done things for more money than that before. So, you know, I would sell out for the pennies that I got for the Fifth Estate. And there were a couple other things he said as well, where I know you could take it with a pinch of salt, but he sort of said, you know, I'm just a vain actor. You know, so, and it's like, well, yeah, it does sound like you are actually.
Yeah, but then you're just a useful idiot, and you're not even a well-paid useful idiot.
Yeah, well, I mean, everyone's a useful idiot to someone, particularly if you're well paid. But he also talked about how there could only be a personal truth, which I thought was really interesting. And he also refused to condemn, actually, very specifically, he refused to condemn the 35-year sentence that was given to Chelsea Manning as well. When he was given an opportunity by the press, he didn't say no to that. And actually, it was the state that released Chelsea Manning earlier than that. But that thing about personal truth was interesting, because Julian was talking about documented, objective reality. And Benedict Cumberbatch was talking about all we have really is our own personal truths. Yeah. I don't like that, because that was Benedict Cumberbatch being a slippery, slidey, faceless chameleon actor. And it was Julian Assange being objective, reality, journalism, accuracy. And that, to me, is the difference between rock and slime.
Yeah, there's quite a few things there, Matt. One of the things, the speech that I always keep coming back to and recommending people to hear, which is Harold Pinter's Noble Acceptance speech, which is a fantastic, like, it's one of the best speeches I think ever. That talks precisely about truth. There is artistic truth and there is the truth as a citizen. And this was at during the Iraq invasion. So it's very interesting in light of what you're saying. You know, he talks about how elusive the truth as an artist is. It's always slipping away and, you know, mutating and all this kind of thing. But that as a citizen, you have truth means truth. But also, one of the things that also turns my stomach, because I went to Lambda, and apparently Benedict Cumberbatch also went to Lambda. But that's a little aside. But one of the things that turns my stomach, you know, hearing what you're saying about and being reminded of that exchange between Benedict Cumberbatch and Julian is the fact that he's also done this film, the film with Jodie Foster about So,
and he's great in it as well, by the way. It's really worth watching that one.
And
wait, which one is that?
It's the
Mauritanian.
No, the Mauritanian is also. Sorry, the Mauritanian.
That's a really good film.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So he's in that, and so he has this funny profile as an actor where he's in these films. Another one is a Netflix production, I think, that where he's a British businessman that's recruited unwittingly. Sort of he's asked to sort of travel to the Soviet Union, and he becomes entangled in his relationship with this nuclear. I don't exactly remember what type of nuclear scientist he is, but he basically manages to smuggle out the plans, and he spends time in prison, away from his family and children. And like, I was thinking, how is this person not, like, he's doing the work of an actor and he's doing it so well, and yet he's so divorced from
on both of those roles.
Like
it's just, I guess it's just being shallow and being a bit of a chameleon. And that's the nature of the actor, whereas Julian is rooted in reality.
Excuse me, Matt.
And that's the great irony. Sorry.
I was like, the nature of the actor. Excuse me, both Adrian and I are actors. And you apparently too, Matt.
I've only ever played a Doctor Who fan fiction baddie. But I was bloody good in it.
So good. Yeah. I mean, no, it's not the nature of an actor. It's the nature of someone who's incredibly sounds very self-centered, lacking in any sort of moral compass. And
it's also it's this double think. It's how people how people can massacre somebody from some control room in the morning and then go home and just I don't know, have a beer by the barbecue in the afternoon and just fall asleep. Like, I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying it's the same thing as what Benedict Cumberbatch is doing, but this disconnect is quite
but it's not the same thing, but it's part of the same machine. And if he doesn't even understand that, and he thinks it's only about money, like he seems to think that propaganda is only about money or something, and he doesn't understand the soft power or anything about, like, he doesn't seem to, or he's pretending not to understand the soft power. You're part of the machine that enables the drone strikes.
Yeah, I don't know what your work there is with that, Matt, but I think that Cumberbatch is probably a very good case study in all of this sort of, especially in like filmography and like what we're, his connection to Julian and all that.
Incidentally, viewers might be interested in Tom Secker's analysis of the Courier, because although like you say, his character plays someone who you'd have thought would trigger in Benedict's head the connection with Julian. The actual overall narrative of that is one of these really anti-Russian narratives, which is kind of sort of presenting the Soviet Union in the 1960s as a major military threat to the United States, but it uses language to basically fabricate that. And then the whole story of what actually happened with the Courier, who's played by Cumberbatch, is also just framed in a way that is incredibly West-centric and makes it look like the Cuban Missile Crisis was averted by this, and it kind of glorifies the CIA within that. CIA, I think, was involved in the production of that film in 2020. As an aside, there's a really interesting avenue to go down there if people want to. If I don't
misremember, I seem to think that the CIA handler has some sort of real qualms, some real she's having some real crisis of conscience of recruiting. Like she's very flustered at one point. I don't know.
I think they have to screw over some contact in the Soviet Union, don't they? Like they have to abandon an asset or something like that. And they always do that in the way that Ileana, you were talking about with the Frankie Boyle thing. They make it seem like that's the worst thing that's ever happened, is that they have to allow some poor man or woman in a foreign country to die. So they often build these things around. In fact, that links in with one of those other accusations about Julian Assange himself, which was to do with the idea that he didn't cross out enough material, and therefore it put people's put assets' lives at risk, particularly in, let's say, Afghanistan. But we also know, actually, if you look at the paperwork on that, well, which person ever was in any problem because of that? I don't think Julian was remiss with any of that. I think he did redact material. He did cross out the right material with no help from the State Department, incidentally. But also, secondly, there's no evidence to suggest that anyone was the victim of having their cover blown due to those WikiLeaks revelations. I think there was a recent story about that. I was speaking to Deepa, where there was some kind of tangential link with someone who had some kind of problem or other. I haven't looked into that, but there's again, assets and things. It's a similar link.
Did you speak to Deepa Driver on your podcast about this particular?
I don't really have a podcast, but I did decide to speak. I just decided to put out a few interviews with Deepa because I felt that the case of Julian Assange was so everything about the legal process, and Deepa is the sort of like the official observer, like a neutral observer, or as neutral as she can be. And I felt, having spoken to her informally at, I think it was Julian Assange's wedding about a year or so ago, I felt that everything about that case was so perverse. I mean, talk about perverting the course of justice. Things like I don't even know where to start really, but every element, every little chapter that I did in those interviews was about some kind of sick irony to do with Julian being victimized. I mean, the one that comes to mind now is when they did an HIV test on him and they said that it was positive, and then then 2 weeks later they tested him again and they said, oh no, it was just wrong. It's like, I mean, all right, maybe it's a coincidence, but it's pretty unlikely to get a false positive on an HIV test, and to put someone through that for a couple of weeks is just disgusting. But there are a lot of elements to that, to his treatment that I mean, that's been identified by people more objective and more in the know than I am as being torture. But the details of it I found just really rattling, really spooky. It was like a horror film to me, watching speaking to Deepa Driver about that, but and reading Nils Melzer's book. It just feels like one day that is going to be, like the Gothic horror. What's happened to the Gothic horror of the early 21st century? What's happened to Julian Assange and how he's been kept in a dungeon for years?
Yeah, absolutely horrific. On
We end it on an upbeat note.
Yeah, on that upbeat note, does anybody have anything else to add?
I was doing all right there.
Yeah, do you have any inspiring words of wisdom, Adrian? Putting you on the spot.
I think that, one, just going back to something, it comes back to me a lot lately, is that in this sort of landscape of almost watching consuming entertainment and information in an atomized way, we're all in front of our private screens and that's how we do things. It's been really inspiring and powerful to do Q&As, especially in person, but with Ithaka, because it goes against that. Also with having acted in a theater and loving the theater and going to the theater, but just being in a room with people again, and after COVID, of course, and all of this kind of thing, but just being in a room with people, that human connection, that one to one, and is so important, and that really gives me hope. I mean, it just means that there are other ways that I think that being conspiracy theorists or whatever you want to call it, that they are trying to atomize us and make us consume media this way and separate us, and so we can't necessarily commune about what we've just seen in the way that we would in the theater. I think that doing a Q&A tour like that, and also talking to other filmmakers who follow their films and connect to audiences so directly. I think that that is, I don't know if it's on the rise, but it exists, and it certainly counteracts that sort of feeling that we're alone, the feeling that we're, that it counteracts some sort of despair as well. It's easy to despair looking at the fucking horrors everywhere all the time, but this does it is something tangible and very very powerful, I think.
If you don't mind me just mentioning, my favorite moment politically of last year was on Question Time on BBC One, when the chairman of the Conservative Party, who's just resigned over that £5 million tax bill, but Nazim Zahawi was on Question Time, and he was asked to apologise for the Liz Truss government, and he was asked repeatedly over several minutes, and eventually he blurted out words to the effect, what would Vladimir Putin want us to be right now? He'd want us to be divided, trying to appeal to the audience to say, come on, defend me. This is exactly what our enemies want. And at that moment, and only at that moment, the audience pissed themselves laughing at him. And that was a really good sign, because that ability of the public to see through lies is there. It's just we need to find the right mechanisms and the right inspirational things, and things need to come together. But the public can do that. They're up for it. They're as cynical as ever, maybe more so. But it's difficult to get those messages through for all sorts of reasons. Not least that one of the greatest messages of this of the past 10 or 15 years is currently in Belmarsh prison. But we can do it. We can still do it.
Can still do it. And I think you're right. If there are more of our voices, the consequences of flack, at least, won't be as harsh. Because you're right. I've talked to lots of people about Julian Assange, and apart from well, then China would do it or whatever, like we discussed, no one comes away going like, no one I've talked to has come away going like, oh no, but those war crimes at the US, that's fine. No. Everybody is on board with it being wrong that he's imprisoned. They just think, the ones that dissent are the ones that are like, oh, but China or Russia, but no one actually disagree. You know what I mean? So public sentiment, I think broadly is with us. It's just, it's like what you're saying, how do we penetrate the mainstream?
Well, Stella Assange has done a good job with that in terms of getting into the mainstream. So there's a good example. I guess it's what's the step after that, both for Julian's sake, but also these broader messages of peace and diplomacy and negotiation, being rational in foreign policy. These are big things to get right, but it's not necessarily impossible to take advantage of, including taking advantage of other aspects of the conversation. So, for example, the right wing of the Republican Party. My God. But they are reluctant, for example, to keep stoking the fires of Ukraine.
But they want to stoke the fires of China, so it's not the best.
Yeah, there's not a great happy ending to this podcast, I don't think. But there are always waves of public opinion and waves that are happening within elite political culture, which can be that can be jumped on, and that could work. At least for a while, and then maybe we can find another wave to jump on, and then something like that. It's all going to be okay.
Oh my God! All right, thank you so much, guys. If there's nothing else you guys want to add, we can stop on that note, which was semi-hopeful. Okay, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Okay, nice to see you.